We shall never completely understand the Japanese mind, but then they don't understand ours either. Otherwise, there would never have been a Pearl Harbor. But we must try to understand Japan because we have become locked in the closest of all relationships, war. Whether we like it or not, we and the Japanese are going to be at very close range for a very long time. So let's see what kind of people these Japanese really are, what they believe in, what they want, and how they get it. And if this tale begins to get a little fantastic, bear with us. We're dealing with the fantastic people. First, let's examine a typical Japanese soldier. His average height is 5 feet 3 inches. His average weight, 117 pounds. He and his brother soldiers are as much alike as photographic prints off the same negative. His pay is 10 yen, or about $2.36 a month. His personal equipment is simple but practical. Fully supplied with ammunition, the load he carries weighs about 60 pounds, more than half his weight. His uniform is ill-fitting, his appearance unsoldierly, even comic according to Western standards. At drill, he may lack precision. But he is hard. He is able. He knows his job. His endurance is phenomenal. He'd just as soon go over a mountain as around it. He lives on rice and fish, or occasionally rice and meat, but often on rice alone. And he's proud of it. He is prouder still of the fact that to be a soldier is the highest human achievement in Japan. He has been trained to be a soldier almost from birth, and into his tough little mind has been drilled and hammered the fanatical belief that Japanese are descendants of gods and destined to rule the earth and all who live on it. To this end, treachery, brutality, rape, and torture are all justified if used against non-Japanese. In combat, his single aim is to close with the enemy in hand-to-hand fighting. He believes that in the attack itself there is some mystic virtue by which greater numbers bearing superior weapons can be vanquished. In his mind, there is usually no question of choice between death and surrender. To him, death in battle is the attainment of an ideal. Where his flag leads, he follows in a blind emotional rush. For his flag not only represents his country, it is also the image of his God of gods. His flag is the rising sun, and the rising sun is the symbol of the emperor. To the Japanese, their emperor is the most holy of holies, their visible God. He is also their political ruler, the natural and supernatural. Religion and politics all done up in a one-man package. Entrust to one man the powers of the President of the United States, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, the Premier of Soviet Russia. Add to them the powers of the Pope, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. Then top it all with the divine authority of our own Son of God, and you will begin to understand what Hirohito means to the Japanese, why they call him the God Emperor. For to the Japanese, Hirohito is a direct descendant of the sun, and what is so high, so brilliant, and so mighty as the sun? Accordingly, no one can stand above or look down upon the emperor. When he passes through the streets, all windows above the first floor must be tightly shuttered. The train to Tokyo from anywhere in Japan is the up train to Tokyo because the emperor lives there. Nor can the emperor be imitated in any way. Only his automobile may be maroon colored. Not even his tailor may touch the person of the emperor, for who would lay hands upon the sun? If you are Japanese, it actually hurts your eyes to look at Hirohito, just as it hurts your eyes to look at the blazing sun. Nor would anyone dream of handling his uncovered picture. When Hirohito's face appeared on the front cover of an American magazine, the Japanese government filed an official protest with the American State Department. Whatever takes place in Japan, it is he, the God Emperor, that causes it. From him all things emanate, and in him all things subsist. He makes the Japanese rice grow. He makes Japanese soldiers conquer the world. In his name, they bring to other people justice, enlightenment, truth, co-prosperity, and peace.
The year 1940 was a holy year in Japan, for the nation celebrated the 2600th anniversary of its founding by the first God Emperor, Jimmu.
If you are Japanese, you believe that Jimmu was the grandson of Prince Ninigi, who himself was the grandson of the sun goddess, Amaterasu Omikami. And she, the sun herself, said to Prince Ninigi, "Go down and rule over the luxuriant land of reed plains, which your posterity is to govern as monarchs." Whereon Ninigi descended from heaven to the land of reed plains and built a palace, and took to wife the daughter of a mountain deity, and she bore Ninigi a son. And Ninigi's son in turn took to wife the daughter of the god of the sea, and they too had a son, whom they named Jimmu. Exactly 2600 years ago, Jimmu landed at Yamato and proclaimed himself emperor over all the islands, saying, "Let us extend our capital until it covers the 8 corners of the world under one roof." And in this way, the Japanese empire was created. Hirohito is the 128th direct descendant of the sun goddess. And since from the beginning the emperor gods have mingled their flesh with mortal flesh, it follows that all Japanese are cousins in divinity. The soldier and the wrestler and the priest, the woman in the rice fields, the factory worker, the geisha girl, the businessman, the diplomat, the fisherman off California. All are members of one family, whose blood is superior to the blood of any other race on earth, because it is mixed with the liquid sunshine of the gods. And what's more, they believe it. And being of divine origin, all their acts fall into the divine pattern called the Way of the Gods, or Shinto, which brings us to the national religion of Japan, Shintoism.
Now, Shintoism will not be easy to understand, but since it is the heart, brain, and soul of the nation and dictates all Japanese actions for the living and for the dead, it is important that we try to understand it. According to Shinto, the population of Japan is one son of heaven, the emperor, 9 million minor gods, 75 million living people, and billions upon billions of ghosts, the spirits of all Japanese who have died in the past. These spirits stand watch over all Japan, follow their soldiers into battle, and serenely float around in every Japanese house where guests are frequently introduced to them. They are so near, the living merely have to clap their hands to call their attention. They are fed choice food, and incense is burned for them. Each living Japanese is merely a link in this endless chain of ghosts. He is identical with them except for the unimportant fact that he breathes and can be seen. Each living Japanese knows he is constantly surrounded by these spirits who guard him and watch over him to see that he obeys the emperor and follows the way of the gods. To watch over special Japanese activities, there is a host of minor gods. The volcano is a god. The lightning. There is a god of the silkworm, the god of the night wind. These pearl divers have a god, and annually they hold a ceremony for him. These farmers have a rice god to whom they offer prayers for a good harvest. These scarecrows are all gods of one kind or another. There are over 100,000 Shinto shrines in which these local gods and spirits are worshipped. For the living Japanese, Shinto decrees that all their actions must imitate the way of the gods, who handle chopsticks thusly, arrange flowers thusly, drink tea thusly, worship the emperor thusly, enter a room thusly, greet an acquaintance thusly. Now, on the surface, Shinto seems to be a nice, quaint religion for a nice, quaint people. And in the olden days, it used to be just that. But today, there's a diabolical joker in Shintoism. For since about 1870, the state has forced into the teachings of Shinto a mad, fanatical doctrine. A doctrine that has brought suffering and death to untold millions of innocent Asiatics, and now to thousands upon thousands of Americans. This doctrine is based on the divine command that Jimmu, the first god emperor, was supposed to have given his people 2,600 years ago. Let us extend the capital and cover the 8 corners of the world under one roof. To cover the 8 corners of the world under a Japanese roof. The Japs have a special name for Jimmu's divine command. It's called Hakko Ichiu, and it has become the national ambition of Japan.
From the viewpoint of Hakko Ichiu, the Emperor of Japan is the Emperor of all the races of the world. There are no southern seas. All the oceans are to be recognized as the great Japanese sea.
And in 1930, the modern American college-educated minister Matsuoka said,
"To save humanity in conformity with the great spirit in which the Emperor Jimmu founded the empire, Japan should take over the management of Asia. then extended to the rest of the world.
If you are Japanese, you believe you have been commanded by heaven to conquer all other races and peoples and put them under a Japanese rule. If you are Japanese, you believe the place of honor among the spirits is reserved for those who die in battle. For they become warrior gods and are enshrined in a sacred temple, Yasukuni Shrine. The names of soldiers killed in battle are written on little tablets and placed at night in the inner recesses of this most holy Yasukuni Shrine. That is the greatest honor that man can achieve in Japan, to die in battle and be enshrined in Yasukuni, where even the emperor comes to bow to him. That's why soldiers, when saying goodbye to each other, often say, "See you in Yasukuni." That's why mothers and wives accept the ashes of their dead soldiers without grief or sorrow. The silent victorious return, it is called. For the dead are warrior gods who live on beside them to be cherished and cared for, to be given food and drink and a lighted cigarette to smoke. That's why Jap soldiers would rather be killed than surrender, for to be killed means they become warrior gods. To surrender means everlasting shame and dishonor to them and their family and all their ancestors. If you are Japanese, you believe these things implicitly.
Bandai! Bandai!
But if you are not Japanese, what then is the real Japan? The Japan of the geographer, the anthropologist, and the historian. The Japan of which the Japanese themselves know little or nothing. The name Japan comes from two Chinese words, ji and pen, the literal translation of which is the land where the sun comes from. The Chinese called it that because Japan lay to the east. Geographers say Japan is a chain of volcanic islands, 1,200 miles long and an average of 120 miles wide, her total land mass being a little larger than the state of California. Rocky and mountainous, only 16% of Japan is suitable for farming. Every human being in Japan lives within sight of mountains, many of them from 6,000 to 12,000 feet high. There are some 50 active volcanoes scattered through Japan. On an average of 4 times a day, Japan has earthquakes, severe shocks occurring about once every 2.5 years, with one disastrous earthquake about every 25 years. There are some 45 cities with a population of over 100,000, only 3 of which are beyond the range of 16-inch naval guns. Tokyo, the capital, with a population of 7,900,000, is the 3rd largest city in the world. And what of the people of Japan and their so-called divine origin? Anthropologists say the original inhabitants of the islands were a hairy barbarian people called Ainus. Later on, fierce Mongolian tribes moved in and began conquering the Ainus. Still later, other tribes from many sources arrived on the scene. The fusion of all these tribes and races resulted in the Japanese of today, not of one pure blood, but of a well-mixed plasma cocktail of Ainu, Mongol, Manchu, Malaysian. Of the history of Japan, historians say that somewhere around the beginning of the Christian era, they elevated to leadership a chief, or high priest, in this case the emperor, who claimed to have an inside track with the gods. This evolved into Shintoism, and the emperor's son myth became the dominant religion. But the early emperors had little political power, for the islands were really divided into many independent and quarrelsome tribes, ruled over by powerful barons or daimyos. These daimyos each had large, well-paid private armies of warriors called samurai. The samurai were the important and privileged class, real aristocrats who lived off the fat of the land without working. As a badge of rank, they wore 2 swords, a short sword for committing harakiri when captured or disgraced, and a large two-handed sword they fought with. With this sword, it was their privilege to lop off heads, arms, or ears of the peasants, either for practice or amusement. To further set themselves apart from the common herd, the samurai developed a code of rules for themselves called Bushido, the code of the warrior. Bushido extolled absolute loyalty to one's superior and reckless bravery in battle. But most important, Bushido not only sanctioned double dealing and treachery, but looked upon it as an art to be cultivated. It encouraged ambush. Jump a man from behind when he's unarmed and you've got a club. When he's alone and you've got a gang. That's Bushido, the art of treachery and the double cross, the national code of Japan. Harakiri was also a privilege of the samurai. When condemned to death, they were allowed to kill themselves rather than be beheaded. The executioner's axe was for the common people. As a result, harakiri became an elaborate ceremony, a form of art that showed bravery and indifference to pain. A man's son or his best friend stood by with a big sword to chop his head off in case he lost his nerve. The daimyos and their paid samurai engaged in unending bloody civil wars against each other for the right to become the shogun. Being the shogun meant being top dog among all the daimyos, a dictator of dictators, ruling the islands in the name of the emperor, who was kept in the background as a religious figurehead.
In the year 1592, the powerful shogun Hideyoshi thought he and Japan were strong enough to make their first bid to cover the world with a Japanese rule. And as they have ever since, they picked China as the first victim. Hideyoshi invaded Korea, but Chinese from other provinces came to the aid of the Koreans. The Japs were stopped, and when Hideyoshi died suddenly, the invasion was called off. But they did a complete job of plunder, taking back with them all the wealth and art they could carry. They also brought back 30,000 pickled ears and noses of Chinese and Koreans killed in battle. These they buried in what is now known as the Ear Mound in the city of Kyoto. It was around this period that something new came into the midst of this warring, bloodthirsty people. Something new and strange. In the year 1521, Magellan had sailed around the world to the Philippines. In his wake came Spanish and Portuguese missionaries who eventually visited the Japanese islands. The strange new thing they brought was Christianity, the revolutionary doctrine of peace on earth and the equality and brotherhood of man. Here was something that dignified the lowly Japanese serfs as human beings. Soon there were some 200 churches and over 200,000 converts. The warlords became frightened. These foreign medicine men were teaching tolerance, brotherly love, peace, and even equality. So they acted. 137 churches were destroyed in Nagasaki. All Christian converts in Tokyo were burned at the stake. Throw out the West. Throw out its poisonous doctrine of peace. And with that, Japan closed its doors. No one could leave Japan. No one could enter. Foreign sailors shipwrecked on their shores were tortured and beheaded. For 200 years, Japan remained completely isolated. And in those 200 years, the world advanced more than it had in the previous 1,000 years. Voltaire lived, and Washington, Jefferson, Franklin, Pasteur. The Americans fought a revolution for the belief that all men were created equal. The French fought for liberty, equality, and fraternity. The power of steam was discovered, and the steamboat and steam engine began to narrow the oceans and continents. The telegraph was invented. China was opened up to the trade of the world. But during all this time, Japan was closed. No news reached her shores. She remained a nation blacked out from the rest of the world, still living in the Middle Ages. Then, in 1853, just 92 years ago, Commodore Perry's American fleet of 4 ships sailed into Yokohama, bearing a message from President Fillmore offering the hand of friendship and the interest of trade. The Japanese warlords woke with a shock from their 200 years of self-imposed isolation. They realized that the hairy white barbarian had machines and weapons that made him powerful. If the sons of heaven were to rule the earth, their spears and swords would be of little avail. Also, they realized how weak and divided they really were compared to Western nations. Hastily, the feuding barons stopped fighting among themselves and joined together. But they needed a central figure around whom they could rally. Available was the God Emperor, who up to now had been more or less of a stooge. So, in 1868, the warlords did away with the position of shogun and elevated Emperor Meiji to supreme dictatorship over all Japan, reserving for themselves and themselves alone the right to speak for him and to guide his policies, a position the warlords have hung on to ever since. Now for a strong military. The paid warriors, the samurai, were too few for a national army, so they introduced another revolutionary idea into Japanese life. The sons of peasants were suddenly permitted the great privilege of bearing arms, and it was a great privilege, for being a soldier almost meant being a noble. And to sell this program to the Jap masses, the warlords shrewdly used religion. They revised ancient Shintoism to suit their purpose and forced emperor worship, military glorification, and fanatic thoughts of conquest to be preached by all Shinto priests. Thus, Japan rid herself of the old samurai, but their fanatical spirit was passed on to the new peasant soldier, Bushido code and all. The warlords now flung open their doors to the West. Posts and telegraphs were introduced, railroads, the European calendar, photography, European dress. A frenzy of modernization seized upon the land. With a politeness such as the world has seldom seen, the Japanese invited other nations to help them build up their military power. And always with the thought, treat with the foreigner, learn his weapons, and then use them to destroy him. The old Bushido double cross. The English, having the best navy in the world, were invited to build up and train the Japanese navy. The French, supposed to have the best army in the world, were invited to train the Japanese army. But when they saw the French defeated by the Germans in the Franco-Prussian War, the Japanese switched to German advisors for their army. From the English and the Americans, they borrowed the outward forms of democracy, the ministers and their representative body, the Diet. But this was all a cruel joke, for the Army and Navy cabinet ministers, still actually descendants of the old feudal barons, are above and beyond any law-making body. They have direct access to the emperor and can entirely bypass the civil government. In fact, whatever Japan took from the West or the Chinese, the warlords never took the moral or ethical principles that went with them. All modern knowledge that has come to the Japanese people, all culture, all ideas, all thinking has been filtered through to the people from the top down. Any new idea is first tried out by the ruling classes, changed to suit their purpose, then with the emperor's blessing handed down to the people as divine law. In our Western civilization, practically all the ideas, the forces that have changed our thinking have come from the bottom up. Evolution or revolution starts with the people. With the Japs, evolution is handed down to the people. Japan was westernized by decree, not by popular desire. In spite of westernization, everyone in Japan still rules over his inferior and in turn bows down to his superiors just as they did in the Middle Ages. Women have the least standing of all. They must obey the males in all things. Even today, there isn't any moral right or wrong in Japan. Merely, are you or are you not obedient to your superiors? For instance, today, a father still has the power to sell his daughter when she is 11 or 12 to a factory or a mill. She will eat, sleep, and go to school in the factory, but all her earnings will go to her father. Or if she is a little older and he needs money, the father can sell her outright to a geisha house or house of prostitution. And modernization has done even less for the standard of living. Individual welfare still doesn't count. Discomfort is supposed to be a divine virtue. And that's why the people of Japan all work as long as they can, and as soon as they can, and as hard as they can. For they, too, consider themselves as soldiers with a divine mission. These women beat the earth in humble rhythm, just as they did 1,000 years ago. These women work day after day, month after month in the rice fields, human machines producing rice and soldiers. Over their heads fly the latest planes to the wars. A diesel train thunders past. But these farmers work and live and eat like they did in the 17th century. The income for the whole family as high as $150 a year and as low as $16 a year. The Jap peasant works harder, eats less, and pays more taxes than any other peasant on earth. But he seldom complains, for he is carrying out the divine will of the emperor. The white-collar Japanese in the daytime uses telephones and adding machines. But when he goes home, he puts on a kimono and lives as his ancestors did in the Middle Ages. Japanese houses have no foundations. There are no walls as we know them. No windows, no paint, no varnish, no curtains, no chairs, and no beds. To sleep, they spread a couple of quilts on the floor with no sheets and lay their heads on hard, round pillows. Their food lacks albumin, fats, and sugar. The standard of living is the same as it was hundreds of years ago, one of the lowest on earth. For Japan became industrialized not to raise the standard of living, but to prepare for conquest. This man in the factory doesn't work a 6-day, 48-hour week for good wages. He works a 72-hour week at starvation wages and frequently dies of tuberculosis at the age of 40.
Why do Japan's millions accept their fate in dumb, regimented silence? Why don't they rebel, revolt, organize labor unions? Well, first of all, having dedicated their lives to the emperor, belief in Japan's divine mission to conquer runs through the whole people. This makes practically all of them willing prisoners of a vicious, ironclad social structure, a system of regimentation so perfect it made Hitler's mouth water. On top of the heap of this social structure are leaders of the Army and Navy, the warlords who surround the emperor. They are Japan's first team. Nearly equal in power are the half-dozen super-rich industrial aristocratic families who own the wealth. They're the second team. And they play ball with the military rulers because the warlords give them cheap, uncomplaining labor and lush profits. And they, in turn, provide the money for the war machines. Next in line are the professional politicians, who are appointed by the government as rulers over the 47 provinces. These political stooges slavishly follow orders because their jobs and their very lives depend on the whims of the Army and Navy leaders. At the bottom of the heap are the peasants and workers, the hoi polloi, the masses. To make sure the masses stay in their place, there are the police, the gendarmes, the Japanese Gestapo, and the billions of ghosts of dead Japanese ancestors who watch over every act of the living. And just in case some Japanese don't believe in ghosts, they have an efficient, unique Japanese invention, the thought police. Yes, thought police, whose business it is to arrest you if you think dangerous thoughts. Who decides when your thinking is dangerous? That's easy. The thought police decides. About 10,000 people a year are arrested for thinking bad, selfish, dangerous thoughts. To keep the aristocrats and government officials from straying from the straight and narrow Japanese line, there is another strictly Japanese invention: secret organizations like the dreaded Black Dragon Society. This secret gangster organization, made up of thousands of fanatics, was headed by one of the world's most sinister characters, Mitsuru Toyama, chief of Japan's Murder Incorporated, sometimes called the unofficial emperor. 90 years old when he died in 1944, this dreaded master murderer held the threat of death over everyone in Japan who dared oppose the warlords too strongly. 1930. Premier Hamaguchi shot down at his desk. 1932. Prime Minister Inukai, Finance Minister Inouye, Baron Takuma Dan, head of the House of Mitsui. 1936, 4 political leaders killed. The Prime Minister escapes, brother-in-law shot by mistake. But the main reason the warlords have been able to maintain their vicious grip on Japan lies in the educational system. Education is compulsory in Japan. 97% of the Japs are literate. But the Japanese school is not an institution for the development of the mind. It is a government-controlled institution designed to teach only officially selected facts and officially approved ideas. The object is to mass-produce students who all think alike. To teach in the shortest possible time only the knowledge and skills necessary to make the student an obedient, loyal subject of the divine emperor. The children are taught only how to do things. Their minds absorb the official lessons like a sponge absorbs water. And like a squeezed sponge, they give back the same water. Teachers are trained only by the government, and only those fanatically loyal to the emperor are allowed to teach. Here are some of the divine thoughts that are hammered home every day.
Our lives will become sincere and true only when they are offered to the emperor and the state. Our race has before it a great ideal, a great commission to assimilate the earth and the universe.
Thus, from childhood, the Japanese are taught they are descendants of gods, a race apart and superior to all others, born for only one purpose: to dedicate their lives to the emperor. The cardinal virtue: obedience to superiors. The cardinal ambition: Hako Ichiu, to cover the earth under a Japanese roof. That is, briefly, the social structure of Japan. That is the vicious system of political and religious regimentation that hammers, kneads, and molds the whole population until it becomes an obedient mass with but a single mind.
By 1894, the warlords thought they were ready for their first modern test of strength. As usual, their first move was against China. The process was simple: you send your armies over and attack. The Japs got the island of Formosa. On February 8, 1904, the Japs stepped into the Big League. Without warning, they attacked the Russian fleet at Port Arthur. 3 days later, they remembered to declare war. By defeating Russia, they temporarily obscured that country's influence in the Pacific. The Japanese were delirious. They had arrived. They had defeated their first major world power. And 6 years later, in 1910, they simply marched in and annexed Korea. In 1914, during the First World War, the Japanese, correctly figuring the Allies would win, declared war on Germany, took the Shantung Peninsula from the Germans, and grabbed off the German-owned Marshall, Caroline, and Mariana Islands. After the war, the Japanese emissaries signed anything and everything: League of Nations, disarmament agreement, 9-power treaty. But they insisted on keeping the Marshalls and Carolines and declared them taboo to all foreigners. Hako Ichiu was coming true. The Japs couldn't seem to make mistakes. They won every war in the field and in politics. Every time they tangled with the West, they got new territory. The warlords grew more popular than ever. In 1927, one of them, Baron Giichi Tanaka, made out a secret modern blueprint to achieve this mad dream and handed it to the emperor. It is called the Tanaka Memorial, Japan's Mein Kampf. It was a simple plan, but carefully thought out. To cover the earth with a Japanese roof, the Japs had first to conquer Asia. To conquer Asia, they needed manpower and raw materials. China had the manpower. Manchuria had iron and coal. So Manchuria would be first, then China. The next step was Siberia with its vast resources of timber, coal, wheat, and metals. Then south into Malaysia and the East Indies with its fabulous empire of tin, oil, and rubber. The United States was the last step. And when the orange groves of California and the cotton fields of Alabama were part of Japan's empire, when the factories of Los Angeles and Detroit were producing for Japan's war machine, then the rest of the world would fall like a ripe plum, and the Japs would have fulfilled Jimmu's divine commandment to cover the 8 corners of the world with a Japanese roof. That was the plan, the blueprint, the specifications for world conquest. But the Japanese are careful people. There was much to do, many details to prepare at home and abroad before putting the plan into action. First, make sure of the home front, for in spite of every conceivable method of thought control, certain Western ideas were seeping into Japan, especially among city people. So Western music was banned. Instead, the government approved this. Western dancing was forbidden. Western movies were thrown out, and the people were made to see pictures of their ancient war heroes. Musicals began singing the praises of the Axis. Western card games were purged in favor of this. It's a game of super chess called Go. Actually, it is a game of military strategy. Western books and magazines not in accord with Japanese militarism were banned. Instead, these books were declared official reading. If We Fight by Admiral Shinsaku Hirata.
The attack on Hawaii must be the first battle in the War of the Pacific Ocean. If one snatches away the enemy's pluck in the first battle, the American Navy will certainly become wearied in the wind of panic. Therefore, attack!
Arguments against American policies by Kawashima Seichiro.
We can land in the Puget Sound and Columbia River, the vicinity of San Francisco, and the vicinity of Los Angeles. But this is possible only after we have destroyed the American fleet.
Baseball was becoming Japan's national sport. It was popularized in Japan by visiting American teams. In 1931, an all-star team led by Lou Gehrig, Al Simmons, and Lefty Grove played in Tokyo to standing room only.
松井村瀬を一二塁に置いて南村左中間に痛烈な安打を放ち松井村瀬ホームイン。
The warlords became afraid of baseball and tried to stop it. And when later on Babe Ruth was brought over by a Tokyo newspaper publisher, the hatchet men acted. One night the newspaper publisher was found butchered to death. To try to take the place of baseball, the rulers encouraged the old Shinto-approved sports like sumo, kendo, and judo. Judo, or jiu-jitsu, is the act of giving in, making your opponent lose his balance, then trip him, choke him, hit, chop, poke, or kick his vital spots. The way of gentlemen, it is called. Jap diplomats think in terms of judo. For example, make an offer of peace just before you intend to attack. Kendo means the way of the sword. There's no defense in kendo. It's all offense. You either kill or are killed. The Jap army thinks in terms of kendo. Sumo, or Japanese wrestling, is the act of calmly waiting or stalling for time. Then a swift charge to overcome your opponent. The Japanese people think in terms of sumo. Calm, peaceful, serene, like their volcano Mount Fuji, with violent eruptions of brutal passions in between. But even as they hammered their home front into shape, the gentlemen of Japan were softening up the rest of the world for their Tanaka plan. To every country marked for conquest, they sent their agents. Army officers posing as laborers, shopkeepers, gardeners. Along the coasts, officers of the Imperial Japanese Navy, masquerading as fishermen, piloted tiny boats equipped with diesel engines and radio sending sets. They fished for pearls off the South Pacific Islands. They fished for tuna off the coast of California. They made some good hauls. Other Japanese traveled widely as tourists, photographing the sights of Honolulu and Seattle. Something to show the folks back home. Still others went to work in barber shops, strange barbers who didn't talk. All this information was collected, studied, filed away in Tokyo, ready for use when the day came for the army to go into action. Wherever Japanese spies went, Japanese propaganda followed, especially in Asia. The message was simple.
The white man is exploiting you. Drive him out. Asia for the Asiatics. Japan is your protector.
Meanwhile, to finance the war machine, the second team, the industrialists, started their briefcase offensive. From the factories of Osaka, the mills of Tokyo, the chemical plants of Nagoya, the steel mills of Iwata, the shipyards of Nagasaki, came the economic bullets. But these belching factories in the cities were not the real machinery behind Japan's trade war. For here was the real machinery. The slums of the cities, where 64% of Japan's products were made in small backroom factories employing 5 people or less. There are hundreds of thousands of these factories in the home where father, mother, and children work in semi-slavery. Taking advantage of these low labor costs, the industrialists of Japan knew they could undersell every other nation on earth, and they did. All over the world, they dumped their cheap labor products. And to their dumping, they added piracy. Countless patented articles were manufactured and sold throughout Asia under their American names. The 2 best-known American spark plugs. Genuine old Scotch whiskey was made in the distilleries of Osaka. Matches made in Kobe were labeled made in Sweden. They undersold silk to the silk-producing Italians. They undersold England's cotton goods in the home of her own cotton industry. They undersold beer to the beer-producing Germans. American toothbrushes, retailing at 35 to 50 cents each, were copied in Japan to retail in American chain stores at 10 cents each. They even undersold us with our own American flag. And with the money accumulated in foreign countries with these cheap labor exports, did they in turn buy automobiles, ice boxes, or food? Did they erect better homes for the Jap workers or improve their living conditions? No, indeed. Instead, they imported oil, scrap iron, tin, rubber, aluminum, and secretly built up their powerful war machine. A fanatic nation turning its sweat into weapons for conquest. Sweat for guns. Sweat for planes. Sweat for ships. Sweat for war.
The greatest weapon made in Japan was the first team product, the Japanese soldier. As iron ore is melted in furnaces to remove impurities, so in Japan, humanitarian impurities are burned out of the child. As the steel is shaped by beating and hammering, so is the boy hammered and beaten into the shape of the fanatic samurai.
final product, the Japanese soldier. Ready to shoot, smash, and slug Jap superiority into all non-Japanese people. And so on September 18th, 1931, the first team kicked off. The warlords, faithfully following the Tanaka Plan, launched their shooting war in Manchuria. Co-prosperity, enlightenment, justice, truth, peace, peace, peace.
In groups of 100, the sick, battle-weary, starved American and Filipino prisoners were lined up, beaten, and searched, then herded together for what was to be for them the March of Death. This March of Death is a lasting monument to the insane arrogance and brutality of the Japanese soldier. Burning with malaria, racked with diarrhea and dysentery, the men, barely able to stand, were marched for some 7 days without food or water. Their helmets were purposely knocked off to expose them to the blistering sun. For hours at a time, they were given the torturing sun treatment. At night, they were packed into enclosures so tight, the men lay in their own human defecation. In the daytime, they marched in the sun. Thousands dropped out and were bayoneted and shot. Those that made it to the prison camps were subjected to unspeakable humiliation and torture. 3 years later, when rescued by MacArthur, this is how they looked. In retreating before MacArthur, the enraged Japs wantonly burned most of the city of Manila. Before our men could kill them all, the sons of heaven had bound and slaughtered thousands of helpless Filipino civilians in the inner city. Co-prosperity, peace, enlightenment. That's roughly your enemy, Japan. A nation with a tough, seasoned, fanatic army of 4 million still practically intact.
A nation that can supply 1 million new conscripts a year willing to die in their foxholes. A nation that believes we will throw in the sponge because they will outfight it, outlast it, outdie it. A nation hell-bent to rule the world or commit national suicide. Defeating this nation is as necessary as shooting down a mad dog in your neighborhood. With only a portion of our total strength, we have already cracked Japan's outer defenses. General MacArthur has brilliantly retaken the Philippines and cut their supply lines to the Indies. The trifibious power attack to retake Corregidor was the payoff that thrilled the hearts of Corregidor's gaunt American and Filipino defenders of 1942. Our Marines topped their glorious fighting history by killing 20,000 Japanese on Iwo Jima. On Okinawa, we trapped and destroyed over 100,000 of their best troops. Our Navy has sent to the bottom approximately 3/4 of their naval strength. Our submarines and air forces have sunk millions of tons of their shipping. From the airfields near Japan, paid for in American blood, our air forces are systematically blasting Jap factories and war plants. Now that the nasty gangsters have been blown apart, now we can concentrate the full fury of our total power on Japan. The power of a navy bigger than all other navies combined. Of an air force greater than all other air forces combined. The power of the best equipped and hardest hitting army the world has ever seen.
We're going to destroy Japan's armies, Japan's navy, Japan's air forces, Japan's war factories, Japan's whole power to wage war.